Thanks so much for that. And yes, we're here with Danny Gomez. Danny, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
So Danny, let's jump into it. We're talking about agriculture, CO2 emissions, supply chain. How does it all work together?
Yeah, you may ask, why are we talking about agriculture when we're primarily focused on tailpipe emissions? And I think, when I think about net zero carbon and what excites me about it is that we are on a journey and we're learning along the way. And I think what hopefully is appealing to the people who tune in is that we're pulling people along that journey. And I was having a conversation here internally with Jake Oga, who is a program manager on our on the Freightways product side. And he actually lives part of his time on Maui, and he runs a regenerative farm, taro root farm or root farm. And he was talking to me about agriculture and just kind of the symbiotic relationship that we have with the earth and what has happened more recently in recent decades in terms of unsustainable farming practices, single crop practices, having like really intense, whether it's dairy farms or any kind of livestock, right? You have these images of your mind of, driving down the road and seeing just rows of corn crops or seeing, driving by parts of a city and, coming across the stench and, that's like the cattle farm, right? And so what has happened recently is that we've quickly shifted into a world of agriculture that is not very sustainable. And as he was kind of feeding me this information, he recommended that I go listen or watch this documentary called Kiss the Ground. And it really just opened my eyes up to the larger picture, right? Like what is actually happening here on our earth, and just thinking about, the fundamentals of the balance of the humans and the activity that we do that creates CO2 and the role that the earth has in trying to sequester that CO2 and what, when we think about what the plants are doing, and we know this, right? They use CO2 as part of the fuel for creating fruits and vegetables and living and growing. And what's happening is they're taking the carbon out of the CO2, they're releasing back the oxygen, which we then breathe, and the carbon goes into the soil, and that carbon ends up being food for the micronutrients in the soil. And so really just thinking about, simplistically, this symbiotic relationship that we have and the imbalance that we've created by being more industrial and having bad farming practices and, just the reliance on hydrocarbons and the burning of fuel and what transportation does. And it starts to really connect the picture. And it becomes interesting in my mind when you have that context, to really just be thinking about the relationship that we have. In an example of like pulling this to transportation, you think about someone who is, whether it's a grocery store who's sourcing produce, right? Like them being aware of what's happening and pushing for more sustainable producers or for their producers to have sustainable practices starts to create pressure in the industry that we can, hopefully all start to move along in the right path. So I think it was really interesting that, as we walk this walk and find nuggets of information and new perspective, that we bring those to the surface and share them with folks. And we were lucky enough to have someone here internally who's actually doing regenerative agriculture in their own business.
For me, when it comes to regenerative farming and regenerative agriculture as a whole, is that if you choose to make these sustainability choices and kind of take this regenerative things, it can actually decrease your reliance on transportation and transportation networks if you're a small family farm, right? In our headlines today, we have a story about how Union Pacific is being pushed to create more or to improve their service standards for these large-scale factory farming operations in California. And you've got these large-scale factory farms that are suffering and not able to produce because they're not getting their cornmeal feed, which is sourced from the Midwest, and that feeds into the transportation problems. But if you're someone who operates more of a regenerative farming system, then you're possibly taking your compost and making that into feed, or taking things that you're using as waste products and making that into feed as well. And while that might seem kind of counterintuitive for what we cover, right, saying, we don't want this reliance on the transportation industry, it can actually help us get closer to our net zero goals. And so when we talk about that, it puts a lot of responsibility on the individual farmer, right? And on the individual onus to say, I'm going to make these choices to become more regenerative. But maybe if you're a factory farmer, what are some of those things that you can try and start implementing in your factory farming operation that can get you closer to being more regenerative?
Good question. I'm not going to claim to be an agriculture expert, but I do know that there is. I was even just talking to my neighbor who has a family corn farm, and there's government programs out there for people to start to, as they implement more sustainable practices. So, for instance, there's a no-tilling subsidy that you can get, and so I think those are important, and hopefully. I think the USDA is doing a good job of trying to educate. And if you watch that documentary, you'll see that there's people who within that organization who are purely focused on educating farmers on how they can be more sustainable. And it's interesting too, the more sustainable as a way to move forward and to be a better, citizen of this world, but also it provides more diversity and revenue for the farms. And so the single crop approach, you talk about like extreme weather, right? That can be really, really detrimental. And so if you have more diversity in crop, then you can protect yourself from those extreme weather events that are potentially taking your crop out for an entire season.
And Danny, when you're looking at this segment or this industry, what kind of barriers of entry could there be for potential farmers or producers looking to become a little bit more aware or a little bit more sustainable like this?
I think it's in everything, right? When we talk about transportation, it's what is, there's a cultural friction there, right? There's a way, we've been doing this for, the newer generations or the generations have been doing for the last couple of decades. This is what you know, and you do what you know, right? And you don't challenge that. And so I think the cultural friction, and then there's obviously a cost, right? Like there's a transition. And so we see this in transportation. Think about people trying to switch to renewable fuels. There's an education component, there's a cultural component, there's an access, a technology access component. And so what I hope is true is that everyone's starting to be more aware of their role. And as these new generations come in, they're hopefully starting to turn, and we see this a lot, even in just the new workforce, right? Demanding more of their employer to be more sustainable, to have higher ESG standards. And so I think it's a cultural shift, education shift, and then hopefully there's enough tools in place that can help those folks make those transitions.
So when we talk about regenerative agriculture, obviously choosing to make more sustainable choices really puts a limit on how much product you can make. If you are not choosing these, if you're choosing these more sustainable practices, you're probably not factory farming, and you're probably not pushing out thousands of heads of cattle and chickens and tons of vegetables, et cetera, et cetera. And that almost changes your demographic of who you are catering to, right? To more of a local, more of kind of a curated group of people. Maybe you're selling at farmers markets, or maybe you're selling at local green grocers, et cetera, et cetera. And when we talk about that, that also kind of changes the way that consumers shop. Do you think that consumers have a role as well in participating in these regenerative agriculture practices by making the choice to shop small and to support these family farms and these smaller farms instead of supporting the giant farming conglomerates?
Yeah, and I think there's also probably a bit of a misnomer too, right? That sustainable farming can't be done in a way that is at a volume that can meet demand, right? And we think about, the majority of the corn goes to feed the cattle that we're raising on these cattle farms. And yes, I think that we all have, even since kind of my personal buying habits, right? Like now I understand the difference of what is cage-free, what is, versus pasture raised. And the education bit on that, I think, is what hopefully will start to continue to come, right? So it is just, going on that for a second, right? Like pasture raised, what does that really mean, right? And so thinking about the way that the animals live off the land and how they put nutrients back into the land, obviously through their manure, right? Like that is food. That is food for the soil. That is then creating more food for us, and it's just again this symbiotic relationship, and understanding the nutritional value behind that. Jake told me, I think the stat was a banana from 40, 50 years ago. One banana had the same nutritional value of I think 3 or 4 bananas that we eat today. And so there is just this awareness of this mass producing of food and how it's not nutrient dense, because the way that they're producing foods is for volume and speed. That does not allow the nutrients to transfer from the soil to the food and to us. And so we're creating this unfortunately cascading effect that is going to start to snowball. Hopefully we can course correct, and people, through awareness about their health really in general, can make more informed decisions, which then, like to your point, sends a signal to the producers to do things in a more sustainable way.
Last question for you, Danny. We know that consumers like to make choices with their wallet, right? What's going to hit your wallet the least? And especially right now when we're talking inflationary prices, we see a ton of markup in some of these factory-produced things because they're incurring the transportation cost, and they are now incurring the cost of production on the front side. And it can almost be cheaper or just as expensive to shop at a small local place than it can to be shopping in a regular grocery store right now. And you can better your health that way. Do you think that this is a trend that's going to continue, and we're going to see more support for these smaller growers, smaller producers, just because the price of shopping factory farming is now equal to shopping these smaller places, but the quality is so much better with the smaller farms?
Yeah, hopefully it opens up people, right? And that they stay on that trajectory even when prices revert back to something more normal. I think it is just being aware and testing it out and kind of starting to break down. I think there's oddly like a weird stigma around being organic. Like it's crunchy, it's organic, right? Like, and so hopefully we can dispel people of that myth. It's just better for all of us together and individually as well.
Awesome, Danny. Well, thank you so much for joining us this morning for this Net Zero Carbon, a segment brought to us by Convoy. We're always looking forward to learning new insights, and we'll be looking forward to next week's episode as well.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to take a look at the last 24 hours in freight right now with our FreightWaves market recap, and then we will take a short break.